Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to install cluster services on OES 2018 SP2. This is my third video. In the previous videos we went through the installation of Micro Focus OES 2018 SP2 server, and in the second video we installed eDirectory, and today we will install iManager so we can look at eDirectory, and we will also install cluster services. So we'll start by opening, instead of going to YAST, let's go, oh no, we'll go to, I'm sorry, go to YAST. Type in your root password and remember to go to the bottom of YAST for OES install and configuration. And we want to scroll down and find iManager. I'm going to expand this a little bit so it might be a little bit easier to read. And as you can see, there's check marks on what has been installed so far. So by default, when you install eDirectory, you get the backup management service. Here's the eDirectory. You get the OES Linux management LUM, so Linux user manager, and remote manager for the server. The main thing we need, though, to manage eDirectory, because this is our only server in our tree, is iManager. iManager is one of the core features of OES. It's the web-based administration tool that kind of does all your management. You'll do probably 99% of your management of your OES infrastructure through iManager. So I've checked the box, I hit accept. You'll now see the software being installed onto the server, and the next page after this will be the configuration. As you can see, iManager is a bunch of different components. There was a lot of plugins in there, so iManager is extensible, so there's plugins for each new service, which means iManager pretty much can control everything, and is in the future, if a new service comes out, there will be a plugin that will show up in your iManager, and you can also customize iManager. So one of the things you see here is everything that's already installed shows up in this configuration page, and you'll see reconfigure disabled, which means that you can't go in there and make a change. You'd have to click the disabled to enable it. So it would switch to enabled, and then you would be able to edit settings if you needed to go in here. So if there's any time you need to make a change, like if I wanted to change LUM, I would have to click this reconfigure and switch it to enabled, then go into this service and make a change. So there shouldn't be anything I need to change in iManager, but I'm going to click on it so we can see the config. And there it goes. It just basically needs to know what tree. I called my tree cloud. It needs to know where the administrator is. I put my administrator in the home organization, and you could the plugins take a while to install, so they do give you the option of not installing them right now, and you would be able to install them later in the browser. You could just ask it to install, but we want the plugins installed. So I'm just going to hit next. And now the configuration of iManager on this server is being configured, and you only need one instance of iManager to control your entire OES environment. But it's not uncommon to install iManager on many servers just for the convenience of having probably local administration. And there's no real negative to installing it on there, but it's not necessary if you want to keep your servers minimal. And I'm going to pause for a little bit while this process goes through. Yeah, it's been about 2 minutes already, and it's still working on it. And that's one of the reasons why you can do the plugins later if you were under a time constraint. This is all installing in I think it's in Tomcat Java servlet that's running on the server, and the plugin process is slow when you're installing all these little plugins, so be patient. And again, I'm going to pause so you won't experience the delay. I just wanted to give you a heads up that this is slow, don't worry. And I stepped away for a while and came back, and it is finished. So I'm going to click on the old finish button, and what we should see now, when we go to the server's web page under Management Services, we see iManager. And that's what we want to do for managing any of the OES services. Okay, I'm at the OES login page. So I should log in. Actually, I'm going to log in with admin. And for the tree, you could type in the tree name. You could type in the server IP address. That's what I'm going to do here. And click next. And sure, I'm going to save that. That's no problem. And here is the iManager page. Along the left-hand side here, you can see all the different tasks that you're able to process here. So that, as you can see, this kind of just covers all your OES management. This is your main console for your entire OES infrastructure. One of the things that we will be doing in this video is working with clusters. And right now I have no clusters, and I have no cluster resources. But that's okay. I'm going to just do a quick little preview of the tree. So when you're in the objects view, you get to see your LDAP tree or eDirectory tree in a visual format. And so my tree is called Cloud. My organization is Home. And the location of where I put my servers were under Home Servers. As you can see, I have one server and some basic server configuration. If I go to Home, there's only the admin account and the admin group. Nothing else has been created yet. One more view that iManager gives you is a little bit more of a visual one where you can, let me set that to allow pop-ups. And basically this view lets you drill down and see your objects here. Then you can click on an object. It'll ask you what you want to do. For instance, I want to modify my administrator. I can add more attributes. You can set up group membership, rights, etc. Anyway, and then the other tab that's very important is search, where if you don't know where something is, you can find it and immediately edit it. You can filter by the type of object, and as you can see, there's plenty of different type of objects on here. The most common you're going to be looking for is probably a server or a user, but everything is stored in E directory for OES, hence lots of objects here. But I'm not going to get too much farther than that. So what we have now is our management portal. We have E directory running. We showed you that we're in the cloud. So we're ready to look at the other OES services. So once again, I'm going to go into YAST, which I have open already. I'm going to go back into this OES install and config. My method of install for this has been mostly just installing one thing at a time. But you don't have to. You can set up multiple services, but like right now I don't have the storage configured, so there's no real file service on here, because you can have special purpose OES servers. Like you can have one that's like a print server. You can do one that's just doing FTP. You can have one that's doing just domain services. So you can break up your services if you want. You can install all of them on one server. So I'm going to do the cluster services. Now, the interesting thing with cluster services, let me expand this so we can see a little bit more, is the install is pretty quiet. You don't really have to do too much to begin with on this, and you can install cluster services along with other pieces. You'll go back and configure your cluster services that you want after the install. So some of the things that they even happen to mention is using the cluster services with iSCSI that's included with OES. You can build an inexpensive clustered SAN, and I've done this when I had a small office that needed the clustering, so they needed some redundancy, and then they also needed the storage to be shared. And with OES, you get clustered RAID with OES and NSS. So you can have two boxes that are rated between each other. So if you had one box fail, the other one will take over, and the storage is replicated between both using mirroring on NSS, and it works pretty well. So that's great for the small office where you don't have an expensive SAN in that box. You pretty much can just use OES as your SAN. Alright, enough talking about that. I'm just going to hit accept here. You'll see the familiar the install happens first. So files are copied to OES. The second screen would be for configuration. but we're not ready for configuration yet. We just want the software on the server. So let it come through. Whenever you get to this configuration screen, you can configure any of the OES services that you need to change here. And we will be coming back just to this screen to configure the OES services. But if you see, by default, it's disabled during the install, so that they know that you're going to install the service and all that, but you're not ready to configure it. By default, it's just that it's available, and that's where I'm going to leave it right now, and just hit next, and it will go through its writing out the config files, and this server will be ready for clustering. What's next is I have to add some storage for the clustering, and we'll do that in a minute. So I'm going to show the config for this VM. I'll go over to storage, and as you can see right now, it has just one disk, and this is basically the OS boot disk. And for our clustering, we usually use two different types of storage. One little small, it could be a small partition. You can make a small disk that's used for the cluster. The cluster basically communicates with other nodes through this shared storage, and it allows it to figure out if it's split-brained, or when there's an issue, they can see if they can both see the storage still. Usually if the network goes down but your shared storage is still up, the cluster can recognize that because it can still write to storage. So that's the design. There'll be one little disk that's used just for some clustering information, and then you'll need some storage for your cluster resource, which is usually storage like NSS volume, but it can also be services, like if you want to do your DNS or DHCP as a clustered resource. You would usually provision storage specific for that service, and then the cluster can decide which resource, which resource or server is running that, which node basically would be able to access that storage, because only one node is active at a time. So what I'm going to be doing is making that one small disk, and then one larger disk that will hold an NSS volume. And that's what I would be doing here, is adding storage. So and here I'm in the virtual machine properties, and I've added two disks. First one only 100 meg. That's a SBD split brain disk. It doesn't need to be large, so I made 100 megabytes. The second drive is going to be for my NSS storage cluster resource, and I made that one just 80 gig for this demo. And then I will power up the VM, and we're starting OES 2018 SP2. Alright, so I'll log into IT. And go to our web browser. There we go. And we reestablished our iManager connection. It's going to ask me to log back in. I'm just going to do a refresh here. There we go. And the tree, like I said, you should be able to do cloud. Yeah. All right. Let me refresh again. There we go. So now that we know the server has storage, we could manage it right through the web page under storage. And here's the storage tab. So the first thing is we can tell if you added it hot, you could tell it to scan devices and it would go out and discover any new devices that have been added to the VM. In VirtualBox I had to shut down the VM to add storage, so in a VM environment, like VMware environment, you can just add the storage live and then you may have to rescan. So first it wants to know what server we are looking at. So we'll just browse down to our server, and there's only one in our whole environment right now. Yeah, so it's just giving a little warning that it can't find the NSS version. Well, there's no NSS, so not. What we're looking. Oh, I'll come back. I'm sorry, I didn't need that. I needed partitions. So now I can hit this little box. It's like a history box, and still wants me to do NSS before I can do anything. All right. I will add NSS to this server so that it will be happy. So let's minimize iManager, go back into YAST. And come down to now via command line I would be able to do some of that configuration, but I want to do it all through the web. And we will do NSS. So I'll expand this so we can see the names. There we go. And if you were if you were doing this in a domain, you would want to do this one. You would want to add this because it adds the intelligence into the NSS to support Active Directory users. So a lot of times you already have an Active Directory, you have your users in Active Directory, and you don't want to have to replicate them into eDirectory for services. If that's the case, then you just add the AD support and your users can be in AD and they can access NSS. If you don't have AD or you replicate your users over then you don't need to add the AD support. So I'm not using AD, so I'm just going to do NSS services. At this point, you can pick other services too that you would want to add, but I'm not going to do it yet because I just really want to configure the disks. So once again, you'll see the standard install where it first installs all the programs, and then the second page is the configuration page. And on the configuration page, you always see what has been already installed. So all your OES services would be configured here. Usually they'll be in a disabled state because you've already configured them, or they don't need configuration. And when you install something new that needs configuration, you would see a message like this, where they even highlight it in red saying, hey, we need something. Usually it needs your admin password because it doesn't know what it is. So I will start by clicking on the NSS, and there it is. It's asking me what is the admin password. I give it that. And then if there's any other settings that I need, I'm leaving all this default, but in a large environment you might need to update your UID range. You might have more users than what they're giving you there, but I'm fine with that. One thing you'll see is there will be an object created in our tree. It's basically a user that NSS connects to eDirectory with. This is automatic, you usually don't change it or anything, but it's good to know that it's there and that it exists. And now you'll see that because I told it what the admin password is, the other system it was showing red, which was this one, doesn't need it anymore because it has the name. So an NCP by default gets installed, and that's from the legacy network piece. You could still use NCP with the OES client. So now all the config files are being written out to the server. And I like doing these one at a time, especially when you first start installing these, just because it can get confusing if you install all the OES services and then also have to configure them all. It's better to do one at a time so you can at least look at all the settings, and if you run into an error, it's only on one service. But overall it's a pretty simple configuration once you go through it. And I'm trying to do all this without having to go command line, although I like command line. It's just it's a lot steeper learning curve if you're not familiar with the command line and all the server commands. So I would say do it this way at the high level all through the browser, and then if you're comfortable, start using the command line processes. And it's finishing up. Alright, so I'm gonna click finish here. Okay, so I'm going back into File Manager, and the storage options will be available. For the cluster, you need basically just to have at least set one drive set to shared, so that you can have the split brain detected SBD volume, which is the one I made that was like 100 meg. So I'm gonna connect to my cluster node. There we go. And I'm going to click shareable. That's, oh, I'm not on the right drive. So make sure you click on the correct drive. And there it says, it hasn't refreshed yet. Yeah, 100 megabyte. So I'm making that my shared split brain detection drive, which is what's needed for the cluster. So I'm going to hit OK. And boom, it's done. So I'm going to switch back, minimize this, and switch back to YAST and configure our cluster. Alright, so I'm going to type OES just to bring these things up. So we go back into our OES configuration. I think I clicked that twice, and I did. Right? It's okay. And so we're not going to be adding anything else here because our cluster service is installed, and we also installed the NSS storage in there. So I'm just going to hit accept. So we're not picking any more storage. This will go right to the config file, and once this finishes reading, we'll be able to add our cluster. And what you're seeing here is anything that doesn't need any configuration is by default disabled. And then, but we want to configure the cluster, so we click on enable. And when we scroll back down, hey, there's a little red thing saying, hey, it needs something. It's basically going to need our admin access. Alright, we can name our cluster. By default, it's putting it in the same folder as our servers, and I'm just going to call it CL1 as our cluster. You could just leave it as cluster, that's a default, but since I named my servers the CL1, I think I'll just name my cluster CL1. You could also make it, like your location. I could have this as home cluster 1 or whatever. So and then by default it's assuming you're going to be connecting into an existing cluster, so I just said no, this is new. So now the cluster will need a IP address. This is for the management service, so I'm just going to go one IP higher than the server. In a production environment, you would have to make sure you have this reserved. And then since I shared this SBD disk, it's available for this. And if I wanted to, I could mirror this partition with another drive. when I'm doing a two-node server where they're both sharing storage with each other over iSCSI, I would have mounted that SBD drive on my remote server, and then that would have been added here, and it would be able to mirror to that remote drive, but I'm not doing that in here. And then you can tell it how much of this storage drive that you want to use for this. Since I specifically made this drive for this access, I'm saying, yeah, you can use the whole drive, which is 100 meg. Alright, so hit next. Here it's asking what the service will be using to log into the E directory, and we're just using our server's common proxy account. Oh, and here it's saying what node is going to be part of the cluster. Well, there's only one server right now, so CL1-N1 is my first node in this cluster. And it says, hey, do you also start the service now? Fine. So that's my config for the cluster. So the management IP is 11. That looks good. So I'm just going to hit next. And the cluster configuration is being written. So what we'll end up with when this finishes is basically a base cluster with no cluster resources. So only the management service is running in this cluster, and there's only one node in this cluster, so it's not much of a cluster. But it's part of the setup, so we can do all the configuration and everything and then add a node and let it join the cluster. So I'm just going to hit finish here, and that is it. I'm going to minimize Yast, go back to iManager, and up here there's clusters, and I go to my clusters, and wait for that to load. Oh, I timed out. I probably have to increase that. Let's do that while we're here. This times out pretty darn quickly. So I believe we can do it in preferences. So let's look at our iManager options. I'm not going to do any of that. When you're selecting objects, what do you want? This is not, oh, I probably have to add a role to do it. Yeah, none of these are the settings I'm looking for. How about here? Oh, here we go. iManager server, configure iManager. And I'll probably have to restart iManager. Alright, so security, who's able to manage this? That's the administrator. The look and feel. If you don't like the colors, you can change them here. Don't see anything else there. Logging. Here's the authentication. remember login credentials, so who logged in last in the browser. And then the default tree, I'll just say cloud. So I don't have to type that anymore. By default, contactless login. If you were using a larger tree and you might happen to have people with like same login name but in a different OU, you might need context. So in large trees, you would probably type in your context. You would have like, United States or whatever. You would have to type it in to be more specific about where you're logging in from. But this is nice and convenient. You just use your username and it'll find you in the tree. More things. Most of this is scalability, where you can add just more pieces. Now here's the timeout. It's saying every half hour is the default, probably. I don't need you to time out. So never timeout is fine. You can redirect when it times out to some type of different page. I'm not going to do that. So I've saved my change. And I'm going to look at just a couple of these other pieces. None of this looks like anything I need, so we're good. And I believe I need to do a restart for those things to take place, but I'm not too worried about that right now. Let's go to our cluster, my clusters, and by default it's blank. So I have to add the clusters I want to manage to the my clusters. So I'm going to browse down to my cluster. Here it is. And press OK. And voila. It'll show up here and there it gets a status. So it's pretty nice. It shows our clusters up and running. And that CL1N1 is the master, currently running the master node base or master service for the cluster. Tells me how many nodes, how many reboots, and if you have the that business portion of the cluster piece, which we don't have. So now that I have the cluster, I could click on the cluster and you can see more of the cluster options. I'll get in here real quick. And in the cluster options, you can actually create a cluster resource. And here's some of the things you can have. So basically, these are built templates for your cluster services. Like for instance, if you wanted to make a DHCP server as a clustered service, you would check this box and hit new, and it would set up the basic cluster scripts, and then you would have to tweak those to meet your needs. The main one is usually like the generic file system one, where you really just want your volumes to be moved around. You can run any type of IP service, so this is just a general script that any type of service that you want to be able to move between the nodes. And so they just tweak them for what you want. If you're doing Zen virtualization, they have some clustered scripts to help with that, so you can have your VM start up on a different node in your cluster. So that's nice for setting up your cluster, just to have a few templates out there on there. So we have nothing yet because I haven't configured the storage for NSS yet, and that might be okay, but I just wanted to go to the resources. I can add resources, and at this point I could do a search. I don't think I have anything that, yeah, that's the only resource I could add, the master IP resource. And so now that that resource is there, I can actually click on the resource and you can see kind of what the cluster options are. You know, it's pretty simple. So here's your fail. It'll automatically start. Doesn't have to fail back to a certain node, but you can make a preferred node. Monitoring, you can set up how you want this resource to be monitored, so you can detect failure and auto failover. If you again had a lot of nodes, you can select the nodes you prefer this to run on, so it will, whenever it has the chance to run on that node, it would. Your scripts are probably one of the primary things you have to modify in here. As you see, they're pretty simple. When this service starts, it basically loads this NCS functions and assigns the IP address to this server, and then exits. That's what happens on load. When you shut it down, it runs that service a second time and deletes the secondary IP and leaves. And then there's nothing happening to make sure that it doesn't keep checking to see if that process is running. So that's your basic clusters. So I'm going to get prepared for adding, let's say, the NSS file system to this cluster. So that's what we'll do next. Right now I'm going to shut the server down and reboot it, just in case iManager needs it for the timeout, so it doesn't time out all the time. So I will exit, and I'm going to shut this down. So, and we will quit this, and I'm going to actually power down the server, which is here. And once the server is down, I will be back and I'll reboot the box, and we will work on the NSS portion. Okay, so I'm back in iManager, and I'm going to go to the storage and initialize that 80 gig drive. So we're looking at cluster 1 and going to drive C, and we should see, there it is, it's uninitialized. Let's initialize that. Alright, so now it has a partition on it. It's actually using DOS. If it was bigger, it would go to GTP. And if I go to pools, just see what happens if I hit new. And we want a new pool name. I'm just going to call it CL1 for now. By default, it's doing an NSS 64. It can go up to 8 exabytes. It also automatically adds the schema for AD support. So now it's going to search and see if it had a drive that's available, and it does. It sees this 80 gig drive. So I will select it, and the pool would just be called CL1. The same name as the cluster. We'll see what happens here. There we go. So I have a CL1 pool name on a CL1 server. A lot of times they would tag these with pool and all that. That's why I wanted to see if it still did. But it's not shareable for cluster services. So this pool is actually is not available as for a cluster resource. And I'm checking here. Oh, and I know the reason. You have to share that device. So I'm actually going to, that's a good thing to see here, is if you don't mark the device as a shared device, it won't make a clustered device. And you can switch it and tag the device as being a shared device. But I want to create this pool on the shared device. So we'll just see that. Now, if you're not familiar with storage, what a pool is, a pool is a pool of storage devices or storage available. Volumes is your almost like LUNs, carved out spaces inside a pool. Alright, so let's go back to devices. And this can all be done command line, by the way, which is what I'm more used to. So I do kind of fumble around in here. But once you get used to command line, it's kind of hard to come back out. Alright, so I'm on here. Here's where I'd say it's shareable. And I will apply. Okay, so now it's only available to as a cluster device. So this time I'm going to say, hey, I would like to create a volume. I called it CL1 last time. I'm just going to say pool 1, just to put something different in there. So now it has to scan. It still sees the drive, but look at now. We have cluster enable on creation. Mount the created one. Alright, so I'll select to use that space. Oh, look at that. It automatically checked cluster creation. So I'm actually going to get a cluster created out of this. Actually, it's a cluster resource. My resource will be called pool 1. So let's hit next. And here we go. You get to see a little bit more of the cluster information. And you can add more protocols to this cluster, but I did not install CIFS. I did not install the AFP, so I'm not going to put that in here. So here's the default name. So it took the name that I called the pool, and by default it puts this naming convention in CL1 pool 1 server. You do not have to take that. You can change this to what you want. So I could call this CL1 FS1 or something like that. So I think I will do that just to be different, because this is the what the virtual server name will be. And then if when you're sharing it out to Windows devices, it wants to know what logical name you'll use also. And here it didn't give me the chance to change it, but we can in the scripts, and we will. So the GUI here doesn't let you change it. And this will be 12, my next IP available. So this is what's kind of nice with the storage. It will make a cluster enabled volume automatically. And there's my pool and what I can do with it. One of the new things is that you can trim it, which frees up purgeable or unused space on thin provisioned volumes. It doesn't have there. You can take snapshots of your pool. That's good for backups. Or you can take the snapshot, mount the backup, and do a backup with and not have to worry about files being opened and all that. Update eDirectory is sometimes you might make a change and it's not reflected in eDirectory, so this always gives you the option to make sure eDirectory sees your new volume and everything. And so I'm going to show you that eDirectory portion. So again, I'm just going to go into the browser so we can kind of see our tree. Here's cloud, here's home. Under home we have servers and my admin user and an admin group. I go under servers, and there's a bunch of little objects for the server, and under here we will see our virtual server that we just created and the pool. Oh, here it did do the underscore pool. So it by default it's CL1 or C1 for the cluster, pool 1, which is the name I gave it, underscore pool. So it did tag that in there. We just didn't see it in the web side. And then if you go under CL1, you'll just see the templates that are available there and the default pool server 1 cluster name. So anyway, in eDirectory you can see all these little objects. And To manage our cluster, we stay in our roles and tasks. We have our cluster. Remember, we have the My Cluster, which I added CL1. Status is good. This is just an overall status with all the nodes. Right now, we only have one node. And then the resources are the actual services you have in virtual servers. So I'm going to add my new resource that I want to manage. So see that Pool1 server name showed up again. And a lot of times you want this to match or make something, make a name that's more sensible for you. Or when you're naming your pool, make sure that pool1 underscore server makes sense. Like I could have had home for my pool, and then it would have been home server. But you can edit these in eDirectory and all that. But I don't really care about the name at this point. I just wanted to let you know that you can make it a little more more to meet your environmental needs. So the scripts are what we want to see. So when this cluster resource gets loaded, we see that the pool is activated. The IP address gets added, and then we get our server name here and the IP address. So the one thing we don't have in this pool yet are volumes. So we want to make sure that with the pool we also want some volumes to come up, and that so there would be a command in here to mount the volumes, or a lot of times the volumes are set to auto mount. So that's the load script. The unload script kind of does the opposite, right? Comes in here, it removes unbinds the file name or file server, and it gets rid of the IP address, and it deactivates the pool, and then it shuts down. Again, here's your protocols. Remember I told you you can add CIFS and all that, and there's that CIFS file name, which we can edit. And I don't have CIFS on here yet, so that's okay. But basically, that's what this is where you would make changes to your cluster node and all that. So that pool is loaded. So one thing, I'm just going to get out of here and get back to the basics of the cluster resources right here. I'm sorry, we're still in that. That's the My Clusters and Cluster Options. I want to go to My Resources. Here they are. They tell you what cluster they're on. You can click in here in order to get the details on them. In the My Cluster, you'll see the list of the different clusters that you have. And inside your cluster, you can see the resources. You could pick which node you want on. So at this point, I could unload this by shutting that off. I can migrate it to another node. I could respond to some type of alert if there was an issue on there. I can also look at the cluster log and see what is going on. And that's the basic configuration. So we're done with the configuration. So I'm going to minimize this, and I am going to open up a terminal just so we can kind of see if you're familiar with any of the command line pieces of OES. It's always good to know the tools that are out here, but one thing I just wanted to do is I can ping that cluster node, which was 12. So it is up. I'm going to go into the NSS file system console. I have to become a super user. Then I can do the console. And so NSS always is reporting in this console, so you can quickly see what's happening. And we see we're loading that pool seal 1. We did that. That was the first pool I created. And then I deleted it. So deactivating the pool, and then it's gone. If I hit the space bar, we can continue and see what happened here. We'll see that, hey, pool 1 got loaded. So pool in the very bottom state, which is pool 1, is set to active state, so it's loaded. So if I type pools, I can see the pool. I can see attributes of the pool. If I look at the far right, there's no volumes. So this pool is just a bunch of space, but there's nothing on that pool yet. So this cluster is actually not providing much except saying, hey, I have space available. So we would have to create a volume for this cluster storage. So I'm going to bring up our storage portion in iManager. And as you see, there's a volume. That's what we're going to. I'm going to come here and say, hey, on our cluster, I need a volume. All right, and we see we have no volumes. And my only option is new. I am going to create, let's do our, what do we have here? We'll do our pictures volume, huh? I'll do caps here. So I'm going to create a volume called picture, or even pictures. Just hit next. I don't know if that registered. There we go. Okay. And then it's going to ask me, where is this volume going to be created? If I had blank drives out here, I could even now create a pool if I didn't already have one, but I have one here, so I just say it's coming out of this pool. Is there a size limit you want to set on this volume? If you set 0, which is the same here, allow the quota to grow to the size pool, so all 80 gig can be used. So you can take out of this pool, you can carve it up for how much space a volume gets. If you don't want, this particular volume to go past a certain amount. So I'm going to say, well, no, pictures can only use 10 gig of the available pool. And you can change this, excuse me, you can change this in the future. So this is just a little soft block. Whoop, invalid volume quota. That's because I didn't take the, I think it might take GB. Nope. I don't know. It's already. Sorry, it's already in gig. So didn't need the 10 there. Like I said, I don't use the web interface very often, and the command line interface does take GB. Okay, so now the volume's being created, and then NSS has a rich amount of metadata that and features that you can set on there. Some of these are really nice. Like one is compression. You can have data shredding where when you delete something, it's overwritten a number of times. You can have quotas on directories inside here, so that's always good if you had like individual folders inside this pictures volume and you wanted to limit people to a certain amount of memory per directory. This clicking this gives you that ability. The other defaults obviously are like mount automatically, so or on creation it's going to activate and mount. Other things you don't really have to worry about, but you could allow the mount point to be renamed. So in the Linux side, if you needed this storage to be mounted somewhere else, it's allowed. And then the migration is another tool you can use. I have not used it. And their salvage is really good. That's the undelete capability and the tracking of your deleted files. So files don't really get deleted after you delete them. So the user can restore their own files. If they accidentally delete something, they'd be able to salvage it back, and it would return exactly how it was in the directory where they deleted it. So it's pretty nice. You can AD enable the volume. So if I was doing NSS with AD, this is basically saying that that AD access, so AD security can be applied, and AD users can use this volume. That means they don't need to be in E directory. By default, NSS is tied to E directory. So it's totally standalone, so it does not require AD, but if you are a AD user and need everything in AD, this makes it easier for those people, basically. And user space quotas is another really nice thing, because you can also limit how much one user gets out of that pool of data. And again, you can modify that in the future. So if they fill their quota, you can increase it. And then the namespaces are some of its legacy, right? DOS, who's going to use a DOS namespace anymore? Mac had a special namespace, and Unix also has a different namespace. So if you're specifically only using these volumes with Unix, you could check that. The default is long, which is kind of works with everything. So that's where we're leaving it. And I'm going to hit finish, and we'll let the system go. So as you can see, this is very much like a NAS or an appliance. Once the OES is up, and it can be anywhere in the world connected to your global tree, which that's why I called it the cloud. You have control of all your storage and services all through iManager. So now we made that pictures volume. So what we're going to see on our storage console is the picture volume coming up. So if I did volumes, and we see our volume is here now. It has salvage, compression, user space restrictions, directory quotas, and trusty index, which is I believe for speeding up getting a metadata on there. But if we look at our pools again, we now see in this pool we have one volume. So we can also, let's just create another one on here. And this one, I'm going to do videos. Why? Sort of like your home directories. I'm just making a special volume for those. And we know like video doesn't compress very well because it's already compressed. So when I do my quota, I'm going to say that they get 50 gig. And no compression. And probably if they delete their video, we'll leave them salvage it. I'm not going to even limit out of all of it, and I'm going to give the user space. So this one I'm leaving it with just the defaults for everything, and I'm going to hit finish. So now inside the pool, the second volume is being carved out. And there we go. We see our two volumes. If I go back to the console, I can see now that we have two logical volumes inside our pool. I can see the attributes of those, and we can see a nice breakdown of the storage and quotas on here. So this console is really nice. That's why command line is nice. So we now have storage in our pool, in our cluster. So I think at this point I'm going to end this video because we created our cluster, we have our pool, and that basically got you 90% of what you'll need to do. The next would probably be adding like CIFs if you're going to use CIFs for like Windows clients, or if you use the OES client, you're pretty much ready to go. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.